Hi everyone, welcome to our first set of lecture notes for the semester. We're going to start off with an introduction into the science of anatomy and physiology. This course is going to cover the anatomy side of things primarily. We'll get into a little bit of physiology, but for the most part we're going to stick with the anatomical structures themselves. Physiology you'll get into in the next course after this one. So as we look at anatomy, the actual anatomy itself in terms of what we're looking at essentially comes from the Greek word to cut up or to cut open. And so this is essentially what we're going to do. And so we're going to take a look at the body as it appears. We're going to look at the organs, we're going to look at the systems, we're going to look at the individual structures that we can find that are there and essentially put a label on them. And so allow us to be able to see the structures and understand how they have relationships with the things that are around them and how they work within the body itself. So when we look at anatomy, we have to keep in mind that there's really kind of different ways that we can look at the body at any given time. And so for the most part, most of what we're going to look at is going to be on the gross level. And so we're going to look at things from the aspect of being able to see it with the naked eye. What can we see with just looking and observing the anatomical structures that are there? But even within gross anatomy, we have other components that are there, other aspects that we can see within the gross anatomy. And so we can look at things from a systemic view, which is primarily what we're going to do is look at the individual organ systems and look at all of the different organs that are found within each one. We can look at them regionally. We can just look at an arm or a leg or the brain, the skull, the thorax, the abdomen, and look at all of those different components that we can see there as well. But from there, we can then look into the microscopic view of things also. And so we can look at things from the very small aspect. And so each of those organs that we look at, we also have the very microscopic aspect of them, which looks at the individual cells that we find within an organ. And then we also have the tissues that are there as well. So different cells make up the tissues. And so the study of cytology, the cells, or histology, the tissues, we can look at it from those 2 points of view as well. So when we look at the kind of organization of the body itself in terms of going from smallest to largest, we see kind of a view where we have the entire organism. And so we can kind of start with the entire organism and begin at that point in terms of the organism itself, or we can begin by looking at the individual cells. And so when we look at cells, we have to realize that as well, cells are made up at the cellular level. They're made up of individual molecules. And so we have the chemical makeup of the different proteins, the different carbohydrates, lipids, and so on that make up individual cells. And then from the cellular level, we can move on and have individual cells that do kind of common jobs and put those together to make up different tissues. And those tissues then now serve different functions, and we put 2 or more of those tissues together, and we can come up with an organ. And then from those individual organs, we can then put them all together to have an entire system. So here we have primarily all of the digestive system shown here. And within that system falls within the entire organism, the entire body itself. And then all the different organ systems work together as well. So at the histological level, we have 4 basic types of tissues that we kind of see in the body. And so those 4 types fall under either epithelium, muscle, nervous tissue, or connective tissue. And they all have different subtypes as well. And so epithelial tissue has multiple different kinds. Connective tissue has even more kinds in terms of the different types of tissues that we find. And then we have the muscular system, and that has different types as well. And then the nervous system really kind of has just the nervous tissue itself. And there's no really subcategories other than the individual cells that we find there as well on those. And so let's take a little bit deeper view into the components of the systems that we have. And so we're going to take each one of those and we're going to build them up into these different components that are there as well for each one. And so we'll get into all of the different tissues themselves coming up in another chapter for each one. And so epithelial tissue works well in the integumentary system, in that epithelial tissue tends to be what we think of when we think of epithelial tissue is body surfaces. And so the integumentary system is primarily made up of epithelium, and that epithelium lines kind of the outside of the body itself. And so it's on a border of the body or on a surface of the body. And then we also have within any given system or any given organ, we have more than one type of tissue. So we're going to have some connective tissue there. We're going to have a little bit of muscle tissue there. So we have these different types of tissues that are going to be involved in helping to make the entire organ system itself. And so even within skin, we have things like connective tissue. And so connective tissue, as the name kind of implies, connects things together. And so this is what helps to kind of bind different structures together, helps to limit their size, protect them, give them different components to them within. And so the integumentary system, in terms of its job, comes down to protection. And so essentially, we want to keep everything that's inside the body in and everything that's outside the body out. And so that's our barrier to the entire body itself. In being on the body surface, it also becomes an important way that we regulate body temperature. And so whether we have a situation where we're too cold or we're too warm, we can utilize the integumentary system to help us out with that. And so the integumentary system has within it blood vessels, and those blood vessels are either going to constrict or dilate based upon whether we're warm or cold. So if it's cold outside, we're going to constrict all those blood vessels down. We're going to stop sweating. We're going to limit the amount of heat loss that we have. And then from there, if it's hot, it's getting warm and muggy out and things like that in the summertime. And so our body utilizes then the ability for it to sweat on the surface of the skin and allow that water to evaporate off in order to cool ourselves off. Although we're sweating, at times the amount of sweat that we have can be very profuse, and that can lead to water loss. But in general, if you think about it, if we didn't have the skin, our skin in a sense is generally dry. And so that dryness of the skin allows us to essentially have the dryness of the air around us to limit that water loss. And so we don't have exposed surfaces where we're losing that moisture all the time. You can think about this in terms of just if you were to sleep with your mouth open all night long. If your mouth is open all night long, you're going to have a dry mouth when you wake up in the morning. The mouth is intended to be a moist surface. And if we don't have that moist surface being maintained, then we're going to lose and the water is going to evaporate from that surface itself. And that's what would happen if we didn't have the skin itself. The skeletal system, which lies deep to the skin, is our next system. And the skeletal system is going to have an ability to provide for, again, protection in terms of our soft organs. And so things like the skull protects the brain. The thoracic cage protects the heart, the lungs. Our pelvis protects the reproductive organs, things like that. But it also supplies the ability to store things like minerals inside that skeletal system. And so since it's primarily made up of minerals, any kind of excess minerals that we have, we can store away there. And so the big one is going to be calcium and then phosphorus. And so we can store both of those inside the bone when we have them in excess amounts. If our amount of calcium starts to fall, we can then pull it out of that storage that's there as well. The skeletal system is also important for movement, in not so much that it in a sense allows for body movement in general. For movement to occur, we need to have muscles. The bones can't move on their own. But what they do is allow us to move more efficiently. We have the ability to move in a much more efficient manner We don't expend as much energy when we move utilizing bones, and so all of those joints that are there provide for a mechanical advantage to the bones or to the muscles themselves. And so that allows us to work a little bit better within the muscle system to be able to allow them to move. So that muscular system, in terms of muscle system here, we're talking about skeletal muscle. And so skeletal muscle is that muscle that attaches either to the skeleton or at least to the skin. So it allows for us to provide movement. And so we're providing some sort of movement. In this case, we're providing movement of the entire body in some way. And that's going to allow us to get around, to go find food, to go find a mate, things like that, to get away from danger, and so on. And when those muscles contract, they generate heat. And so one of the big things that they're going to cause to occur is a heat production that occurs within the muscles themselves. And just think about it, when you go and you work out or you're exercising in some way, you go run up and down the street, things like that, you start to get warm. And that's because those muscles give off heat as they are functioning. They do aid in the circulatory system as well. And so this is going to allow for squeezing of blood vessels to help to return blood back towards the heart. From there we have the nervous system. And so the nervous system is one of two ways that we provide for communication in the body. And so that communication that occurs within the body itself is done one way by using the nervous system, and this provides for a very fast, quick communication. So we can respond to different kinds of stimuli that is occurring within our environment, both outside of the body and inside of the body. And as it does so, when it's looking at things that are happening inside the body, it's going to control basically all of our other body systems. And so it's going to allow for that control of everything that's going on inside the body, and as well as much as we can, kind of outside of the body itself. All of those nerves that we see here on that nervous system allow for us to be able to control the muscles that provide for movement. And so they're the ones that are going to regulate when we start contraction, when we stop contraction, how long we contract, how short we contract, depending upon where we're moving the body at any given time. The other way that we have to communicate within the body is the endocrine system. And so the endocrine system allows us to communicate as well, but it's a much slower communication. And so it allows us to communicate over long distances. And one of the downsides, in a sense, to the endocrine system is that the communication needs to travel through the bloodstream. And so it's going to travel with the cardiovascular system. And so instead of having a centralized system where we have in the nervous system, where we have the brain and the spinal cord, here there's no kind of centralization. We've got endocrine organs that are basically all over the body. And so all of those organs are found in different areas. And in order to get them to their target organs can be very far away as well. And so hormones, in terms of things like the thyroid gland, it affects almost every single cell within the body itself. And so it needs to be able to get, in a sense, all the way from that thyroid, even down all the way to the foot. And so with that communication, it needs to be able to travel those long distances. And the thing about those long distances is that there's no one-way communication. Whereas with the nervous system, essentially it goes directly from point A to point B. The endocrine system travels and circulates throughout the entire cardiovascular system itself. And so it's, in a sense, almost diluted as far as its communication goes. But whereas the nervous system is very quick to get its signal to where it needs to go, it's short-lived. It doesn't last for very long. The endocrine system, its effects when it sends out its signal is quite long-lasting. And so those changes can oftentimes occur rather than being just a fraction of a second in terms of time. Here with the endocrine system, we're now looking at potentially minutes, hours, days, weeks. So the cardiovascular system becomes our system that we utilize for distribution. And so this is going to be our distribution system for everything from individual cells to our hormones that we just talked about, to nutrients that are coming from the digestive tract, to gases to and from the tissues, as well as from to and from the lungs. And so it's our highway, in a sense, for distributing substances to every place in the body. We deliver nutrients and oxygen to the tissues. We pick up waste products from those tissues, pick up carbon dioxide from those tissues, and carry them away for us. And so it's kind of like the postal service or something like that. It's a delivery in a pickup. And so we can deliver things out, we can pick things back up simply by using the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is not a 100% efficient system. And so when it delivers those nutrients out to the tissues and picks up the waste, it always leaves behind a little bit in terms of fluid. And so that fluid needs to be gotten back up by the lymphatic system. And so this is what accounts for essentially the fact that throughout the day, things like your feet start to kind of swell as the day goes on. And so as we're upright all day long, all of that fluid is kind of from the cardiovascular system, it's taking gravity and falling down towards the most dependent area of the body. So it starts to fill, in a sense, down by our feet. Once we lay down during the night, though, all of that gravitational pull is now gone. And so all of that fluid can come back out of the feet and the legs. In some people, if their cardiovascular system is very inefficient, it can lead to rather a bit of swelling down in the feet as well. And so we can start to see that quite a bit there, just simply from that swelling that can occur. Not only does the lymphatic system pull that excess fluid out of the tissues, but it also, if it encounters any kind of pathogen, it's going to initiate and turn on the immune response. And so we're going to get an immune response that may be there because we had a cut in our skin, we came in contact with bacteria or a virus or something, and that's now kind of coursing through that fluid there. It's going to attack it, destroy it, before it has a chance to move deeper into the body. Our respiratory system is all about gas exchange. And so essentially the lungs themselves are designed to very efficiently allow for oxygen to move into the body and carbon dioxide to move out of the body so that we can get that constant exchange of gases to occur, so that we're constantly allowing for our body to regulate its need for oxygen and the exhalation of carbon dioxide. In order for our body to function, we also not only need things like oxygen and to get rid of carbon dioxide, but we also have to be able to get the nutrients into the body that all of our cells are requiring. And so our digestive tract is doing that for us, in that it breaks down our food. And so when you think about it, food goes in, so we take a bite of food, and in kind of the grand scheme of things, it's really big. And so all of those nutrients are in the carbohydrates and proteins and lipids and everything that's inside there. And in order for it to get into our cells, we've got to get it down into something that's basically microscopic. And so that process begins with mechanical and chemical digestion. We have to break it down into smaller and smaller bits so that eventually it gets to the point where it can be absorbed. And so we can get all of those nutrients to be absorbed, but anything that we can't absorb ends up leaving the digestive tract as waste. And some of the waste that's there is actually waste that we put into the digestive tract so that we get rid of it, and it's gone out of the body as something that we don't need to maintain within the body anymore. Another way that we get rid of the waste out of the body is through the urinary system. So the urinary system gets rid of waste that we would normally call our cellular waste. This is our what we call nitrogenous wastes. And so all of these nitrogenous wastes are basically the byproducts of all of our cells doing their job. And so they do their job and they create waste products. Those waste products then need to be gotten out of the body. We've got to get them out of the body itself. And the urinary system is the primary way that we get rid of all of those nitrogenous wastes. And along the way, we're able to balance water. And so if we drink a whole bunch of water and we don't really need it, then the kidneys are going to get rid of it. If we haven't drank a whole lot of water throughout the day, say, and we're starting to become dehydrated, then we're going to conserve that water. We're not going to make as much urine, we're going to make it more concentrated. So make rather than a dilute urine and losing all the water, we can make it concentrated. And then we also do things like balance pH in the blood by utilizing the urinary system as well. And then we have the reproductive systems of both the male and female. And in the end, in a sense, both the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system have kind of similar functions. And so it's to produce gametes. In the case of males, this is to produce sperm cells. And at the same time, in order to do so, we need hormones. And so it's going to produce the male hormones, primarily testosterone, within the body. And that's going to allow for the production of the sperm cells. In the female, the production of gametes is driven partially by estrogen. And so we have, once again, gametes. In this case, they are our egg cells. And those egg cells are what the female is going to produce for her gametes. And in the process, also produce female hormones, primarily estrogen and progesterone. And so we're going to see those hormones being produced to allow for the reproductive system to function normally. So now that we've kind of seen essentially what we're going to see in the entire course as far as the systems go, now we can start to look and see how we can start to relay information from one person to the next and about anatomical terms and make sure that everybody's in a sense on the same page. And so anatomical terms are a way for everybody to get an idea about exactly where we're talking about at any given time, no matter who we're talking to. If we can use these same terms, everybody's going to know exactly what we're talking about. And one of the most important things when it comes to anatomical terms to think about is that when we're doing this, we also need to have everybody thinking about the body being in the same position every single time. And so that's what we call anatomical position. And so we're going to think about the body in terms of this anatomical position. And this is going to be our starting point. And so anatomical position, much like the image here, we have the person standing upright. They're looking forward. Their feet are flat on the floor. Their feet are pointing forward. And in terms of their arms, their palms are also facing forward. So everything we see in this image is everything on the front of the body. And so this is everything that is the front side of the body. This is our anterior side. And so that's why when you think of your hands, when you think of the back of your hand, it's the opposite side of the palm. That's always the back of the hand. And that's essentially anatomical position when we think about it that way as well. Sometimes when we look at the body, we want to be able to, in a sense, cut part of the body up in certain ways and look at it from a different view, in a sense. And so we'll use things like planes. Planes are also used in terms of doing things like special imaging. And so things like MRIs and CT scans essentially take a slice of the body in a particular plane. And so when we want to see the body in terms of being front and back, we're going to do a coronal or frontal plane. And so the coronal plane divides the body up into a front half and a back half. We can also do a transverse plane, And this is where, if you've seen like MRIs and CT scans, a lot of times you'll see a transverse type of a plane that's there, because this is one of the more common cuts that they'll do on an MRI or a CT scan, is the transverse plane, and then usually combine that with oftentimes a coronal cut or a sagittal cut. And so the transverse is top and bottom. The sagittal cut is a left and a right. And so the sagittal cut has the ability to divide the body into left and right halves. It can be exactly left and right halves in that we have a mid-sagittal cut. The mid-sagittal cut is special because this is what divides the body up into equal mirror images, at least on the surface of the body. And so not all organ systems give us an exact mirror image from left to right. Things like our muscles and our bones, we get this very much mirror image when we do a mid-sagittal cut. But other organ systems like the cardiovascular system, the heart's not exactly in the middle of the chest. Things like the digestive system, we don't have exactly the same organs on either side. There's not two stomachs, so we can't have that mirror image there for those. So as I said, the sagittal plane is dividing the body into left and right halves that we have there. So the middle one is our mid-sagittal. Anything that's, in a sense, off of that mid-sagittal is a parasagittal, or just a sagittal type of a plane that's there. Once in a while, and this is used especially in imaging for like joints and things like that, or possibly sometimes looking for like a tumor, things like that, is an oblique plane. And so this is one where it's kind of coming, it's not perfectly either a sagittal cut, nor is it perfectly a transverse cut. It's somewhere in between. And so an oblique plane combines those two and allows us to kind of cut along two of those different pathways that's there. So not only do we need to know kind of how to divide the body up, but we also need to know terms, so that when we say that one thing is anterior or posterior or medial or lateral, that it's changed based upon the other position within the body that a particular organ or structure lies. Everybody knows exactly what we're talking about once again. And so front and back of the body is just simply anterior or posterior. And so anterior is on the front of the body. Another term that's oftentimes used, and depending upon kind of what resource you're looking at, sometimes anterior is used, sometimes posterior is used, and then also sometimes ventral and dorsal are used. And so anterior and ventral are synonymous, and then posterior and dorsal are synonymous as well. We can use those both. Certain structures within the body, we'll find as we go through things that a particular structure is named a posterior and then fill in the blank, or something else is a dorsal and then fill in the blank. And so the easiest thing to come to mind is part of the nervous system, and within and around the spinal cord we have a dorsal root ganglion, but then we also have a posterior root. And so depending upon how the books read, or who's writing about it, they may use one or the other. From there we have superior and inferior. And so superior and inferior are just simply up and down in a sense, and so top or bottom. The most superior thing we have would be essentially the hair on the top of your head, and the most inferior thing we would have would be the soles of the feet. Other times we use to kind of give us a superior versus an inferior, especially when we're talking about the torso, is cranial versus caudal. And so we can have a cranial and a caudal view as well. And so the cranial refers to the head or the brain, and then caudal refers to the tail. And so we'll see those structures there. And so things like the cranial nerves are something that, knowing that term, we're going to look for something that is in and around the head, versus like the cauda equina. And so it's the tail of the spinal cord. And so this is the bottom portion of the spinal cord itself that we have. From there we have proximal and distal. Proximal and distal are used to describe primarily the limbs, and so arms and legs. And so things that are more proximal are towards the core of the body, back towards the torso. Things that are more distal lie further away. And so things like our elbow is proximal to the wrist. But that same elbow is distal to the shoulder. And so it's further away from the core of the body compared to that shoulder that's there. And so proximal and distal allows us a way to talk about things that are in the limbs as well. From there we have, and it kind of goes along with that of the sagittal plane, is we have medial versus lateral. And so the midline of the body there is essentially the most things that would be the most medial that we can have. And then things that are further away from that midline are more lateral. And so the structures that are there, we can think of things like our nose and our eyes. The eyes are lateral to the nose, but our eyes are medial to our ears. And so we use that kind of terminology to describe one thing versus another. When we start to look at things like muscles and then other organ systems as well, we'll use the terms superficial and deep. And so we can think about it as being kind of like even, we'll get it into even when we start to think about the skin. And so the skin has multiple layers to it. And within those multiple layers, one is going to be more deep and one is going to be superficial. And so one layer is more superficial to another, or one layer is more deep to another. The proximal and distal we covered on the other slide there. And so once again, things that are more distal are towards the ends of the limbs. So our fingers and our toes are the more distal of those two. Things like our shoulder or our hip are more proximal as far as the limbs are concerned. In your book, you have a couple of different pictures that are there on page 13, figure 1.7, and they relate to the terms within the body that are used for different regions of the body. And so these are our anatomical landmarks. And so every region of the body kind of has a particular name that's associated to it. And that allows us to determine essentially what it is we're talking about. And essentially most of the anatomical structures that are in that area are going to be named keeping that part of the body in mind. And so when we look at things like the femoral region, we'll end up seeing that we have muscles there. And so we have things like biceps femoris. We have the femoral artery, the femoral vein, the femoral nerve. And all of those structures are named based upon that component that is there for that region of the body. Same thing goes for the upper part of the arm is the brachial region. And so that's going to tell us about things that are in that area. And so if we see a term like biceps brachii, we know that we should be looking in the arm rather than biceps femoris, which is going to tell us that we should be looking in the thigh. And so that's going to give us a differentiation for where within the body each one of those areas can be found. And they apply both on the anterior and the posterior side of the body for those. And so that's a quick way to kind of get the ability to see a term and have a good idea for where exactly in the body, you should be looking for it. From there, we can look at the body in terms of cavities. And so we have kind of open spaces within the body. The two biggest of which are what we call the ventral body cavity and then the posterior body cavity, also referred to as the dorsal body cavity at times. And so both of those terms can be used with that. The posterior or dorsal body cavity contains the central nervous system. So it contains the cranial cavity where the brain is housed, and it contains the vertebral canal where the spinal cord is housed. The ventral cavity contains a combination of structures that are all within the torso. And so we have the thoracic cavity, which is separated from the abdominal cavity via the diaphragm. And so the diaphragm is a physical barrier that essentially stops things from the torso in the thorax from being able to get down into the abdomen, and vice versa. We can't go up from the abdomen really and get into the thorax. Whereas with the abdominal and pelvic cavities, there's no physical barrier here. And so although there's a line drawn here, this is just an imaginary line. And so that imaginary line is there, but there's no physical barrier there. And so in between the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, we in a sense just have organs filling the space, which is why oftentimes it's referred to as just simply the abdominal pelvic cavity, because both of them are a unseparated space within. That abdominal pelvic cavity can also be divided up in terms of terms into quadrants. Using the umbilicus as the center point, we can divide it into rights and lefts in either the upper or the lower quadrant. And so we have a right upper quadrant, we have a right lower quadrant. We have a left upper quadrant, and we have a lower left quadrant. That allows for many areas and many organs to be found within each of those areas themselves. And so each one of them is housed within that space that's there, and we can help to divide it up and kind of determine what's in each of those spaces that are there. But it leaves a lot of organs essentially visible that's there. But this is a good time to start to think about the idea that when we're looking at this person here, this subject, it is their left side of the body and their right side of the body. It's not ours. And so although when we look at it, this is on our right side and our left side, but that doesn't matter. It's their part of the body that is in question. And so if somebody came in to, say, the ER and they have a broken arm that they want to have looked at, and you're looking at them and you can see that it's this arm over here that's broken, you're not going to look at that and say, oh, well, that's their left arm. They have a left broken arm. No, it's their right arm. So always keep in mind that it's the model or the subject that you're looking at when it comes to rights and lefts. Since those quadrants really leave a lot of space available, or in terms of each quadrant contains a large number of organs that are there, we can also look at it in terms of regions. And so we have 9 regions, but only 4 quadrants. So since it's 9 regions, we have a lot less organs in each area. So if somebody's having pain, say, in a particular area, say the right iliac region here, we know that it's fairly limited as far as what's found in that area. And so one of the things that we typically would think about in terms of a right iliac pain would be something like the appendix. So kind of when you look at the abdominal pelvic regions, one of the easiest way to kind of think about it is in terms of the center point here being the umbilical region to start. And so we'll use the umbilical region as kind of our starting point and then go out from there. Above the umbilical region, we have the epigastric region. And so being around the stomach. We also then have hypogastric, below the stomach, on those. Staying at the top there, we'll go to our hypochondriac regions. And so we have a right hypochondriac and a left hypochondriac. Below that, we then have the lumbar regions. And so we have a right and a left lumbar. This is in the region of the lumbar spine and the lumbar region of the body. And then below that, we have our iliacs. And so we have a right iliac and we have a left iliac. Sometimes those are referred to not just as iliacs, but as inguinal. So we have our right inguinal and our left inguinal, based upon the inguinal canal being along there as well for those, and the iliac bone being in those regions as well for those. And with that, we will end our first chapter.